Start recording. And I would like to take a moment to thank everyone for attending this evening's meeting. A special thank you, excuse me, to Vance Haugen, retired extension agent, but longtime grazing advocate, fantastic guy working with cattle. And he is going to share his knowledge with us on gearing up for grazing and how to get up and going with your grazing system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Vance.
Okay, well, thank you, Mary. I really appreciate being here tonight. I've attended many Zoom meetings during the pandemic, but this is the first one that I've had an opportunity to teach. So this will be this is a new experience for me, but I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity. As Mary indicated, if you've got questions, type them in on the chat part of it. Then she'll be able to read them, and then we'll be able to maybe even during the presentation, I might be able to answer some stuff. And if not, we've left a lot of time at the end for questions, answers, and discussions topics. So basically, it's going to be about an hour presentation, and then we have up to an hour to be able to do some of the discussion and some of the questions. And so what I was told is that tonight we're going to be taking a look at some of the beginning things. And while I don't want to get it too simplistic, it really is simple. Well, one of the analogies I've used over the years, and I was a county extension agent for 33 years and a grazing advocate for about 29 of those 33 years, is that just about anybody can learn to play the guitar. And and if you're motivated, it doesn't take very long. In about a week, you can figure out 3-4 chords, and you can get a lot of things done. And then you can spend the rest of your life getting better. And it's a fun experience. But that's one of the things to think about grazing. Grazing is relatively simple, but the nuances are infinitely nuanced. There's just so many different things. But the basics are pretty simple. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see. Do I move that, Mary, or can you move that? Oh, yeah, okay, there we go. So we're going to be talking about grazing, and obviously we're going to be talking about grass, legumes, species, and other stuff. But I think it really is important that we talk, the most important thing to think about is your soil. And so there's a whole bunch of things that we can talk about on soil. This was a picture actually from a soil pit in Crawford County when I used to do some soil health things over there. But the long and the short of it is that the interaction between your animals, between the species of grasses, legumes, forbs, and other things that you're growing, and the soil is really what makes you a grazor. And we're learning more and more about those interactions. One of the things, I guess I got kind of a hobby horse, if you will. Some people are saying, well, this is all new knowledge. If you've been plugged into some of the cover crop stuff, or you've been talking about some of the mycorrhiza and some of the soil life things, those are all really interesting things. And if you go back and take a look at textbooks from the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s, all of that stuff had been documented. But the and part is that a lot of that just got stripped away down to two basic, or I would say a basic understanding that, well, we really only need to know, maybe 4 or 5 things about the soil, and all the rest is irrelevant. Now, that's not true. When we can talk later about what some of the major importances are, but what I would like to really stress is that if you're going to start grazing, we got to take care of the soil. We've got to know where we're starting. So to find out what the pH of the soil is, which basically is the acidity or the basicness of the soil. We've got to know how much organic matter is there, and it's a good idea to know what the phosphorus potassium levels are, and that's a really great start. And then from there we can move on to lots of other different things, and then hopefully with some balance we can make things work, and we can take a look and make your pastures look what like this next slide is going to look like. And this is a picture, an actual picture of some Festoleum and ryegrass down in our North Valley here on our grazing farm in southern Minnesota. And I'm here to tell you that this is not how everything started out. It took a while to build up to get to this, but this is what you really want to have. Eventually you want to have grass, legumes, forbs, other things to feed your critters. And this was one part of how we got there. Now, part of it had to do with fertility, part of it has to do with management, and then part of it has to do with having vision of where you're going with some of these things. So if I could have the next slide. And we'll just talk a little bit about Springside Farm. Actually, this is that close-up that you had on the previous slide is actually about halfway up that picture, and this is some of our most productive ground in the valley. And just an aside from you folks out there, you might be wondering, well, why in the devil am I not showing a picture of myself, and why am I not moving my own slides? And I'll tell you, it's not because I don't want to. I would really enjoy being able to do that. But I am in a part of rural Minnesota that has absolutely trash for internet service. So I'm just really, really glad that I'm able to see some of this and you're able to hear some. So I really appreciate you for bearing with me. And as we talk about lobbying and try to make things better out in the countryside, making sure that we have high-speed internet to all of our rural communities. I just can't emphasize enough how important that really is. So just a quick aside about our farm, and again, I'm very dairy oriented, cattle oriented, but I have worked with sheep. We used to have a 60 ewe flock, so I've worked with sheep. I've done pasture pigs. I've done pasture chickens, and I've done goats. So I've done a few different things, but predominantly my work has been with dairy cattle and beef. But our farm here, we'll talk a little bit more about it. About 230 acres. We've got about 187 grazable. We've had some watering systems put in over the years, and we'll touch on watering systems a little bit later. Not so important if you're in beef, goats or sheep, unless you have milking goats. But lots of important things. So anyway, the point is that certainly have done a lot of grazing. And when we first moved to this farm, 1993, it was an FMHA farm, and it was sold at a bankruptcy auction, and it had been corn and beans for like 10 years. So it's taken quite a few years to get things back in shape, but it's moving along. So if I could have the next slide. This is just an aerial view of the farm. Like I said, we're a commercial dairy farm. We are not organic. We are grass-based. Currently shipping to a farmer-owned cooperative that does not pay us anything extra for that, but we're working on getting some value-added dollars for our grass-based milk, which looks like it. was going to happen a year ago, March, until the pandemic hit. But at any rate, things are moving along. So, but as you can see from this picture, we have lanes, we've got different ways of wheeling those cattle around, etc. And one of the things that we haven't grown a row crop on this farm for 25 years. So it's all grass. We do till occasionally, and we put in some annuals and some other things. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But it's it's really important, I think, to kind of frame what you're trying to do out there. And so if you're a beginning grazer and you're thinking about doing things, what species or species do you want to work with? There are some opportunities to mix cattle along with goats, or you can do it the other way around, have goats and have a few cattle with it. They graze different things. So there's many different ways. And I'll just touch on this in that while we talk about, grazing, having pastured chickens and having pasture hogs and stuff, I think one of the things to remember is that on both of those two species, the amount of nutrients that they get from the pasture is fairly negligible. Pigs, in particular, there is some work on, they actually can process some forage even though they're not ruminants. Chickens obviously do eat some grass, etc. But basically it's insects and other stuff. But basically it's where they're raised and some of those other things. So it's basically our ruminant animals that we want to focus on. And absolutely nothing wrong with having these other species out there. And in fact, it can be a good complement. But if you take a look at the research, the amount of nutrients that pigs and chickens will get from pasture and paddock is pretty small. And again, nothing wrong with that. But again, if you're looking at your business model, you might want to be real careful with that. So let's have the next picture. Next slide, please. So of course we have to have fence, and I see from my screen that my friend from the north, Lynn Johnson, is on, and right now I'm sure he's spitting tacks looking at this wonderful quote unquote fence, and it is wonderful. 2 strands of barbed wire, wooden posts, and woven wire, and this will keep damn near anything in, and that's very true. It will. This actually is a very good fence. And it's super expensive to install, and it's super expensive to maintain. And that's why when we take a look at fencing, there's lots of different fencing costs, and I really like to use some of the Iowa State fencing costs. So if you're interested in taking a look at what it's going to cost for you to put up some fence, you can get those numbers. I know NRCS has got some rule of thumb numbers for cost sharing and other things for some of the fencing. But the long and the short of it is that you need some type of fencing to keep your critters, whatever those critter, if it's single species or species, to keep them in. And while this will certainly work, I really don't recommend it unless you have some really site-specific reasons for doing some of this. Technology has changed and has changed things, and so 70 years ago, 80 years ago, this is what you had to do if you wanted to have a just about foolproof fence. But now we don't have that, so we can have very inexpensive fencing that will work for almost all of our classes and of livestock. And so if we look at the next slide, we can see what that technology is. Now this happens to be a Gallagher low impedance fencer, and I don't care what brand you want to take a look at. Speed Right is a wonderful brand. There's many different ones. We just happened to go with Gallagher 30 years ago. And just as an aside, this Gallagher fencer, this was the first one that we purchased for our farm. And you can see that we have many different things going on here. there's a lightning choke, and there's a couple of arresters. And if you might look closely, you might see that there's the outlet for this fence, and it's a 110 volt fencer, is on that post or on that piece of wood, plywood that's there, and then there's a box that goes over it. But it's because of these low impedance fencers that really the grazing movement has taken off. However, having said that, looking back in the records, there was a lot of work on rotational grazing done just before World War II, and then after World War II in the 40s by Voisin in France. And they used different type of fencing. They used the woven wire, they used the barbed wire, they used rock walls, they used hedges, thorny hedges, all kinds of different things. And all of those things could work, but man, they were labor intensive. There was a lot of, tremendous amount of planning that had to go in ahead of time, and a lot of upfront costs. But in the 70s and 80s, when the low impedance fencers came on. Now, let me back up. I'm talking about low impedance fencers. Before that, there were other fencers back in the 40s and 50s, and they were basically they would pack a punch. The problem is that they were very easy to ground out. There was a lot of issues with burning. You could cause fires. But anyway, in the 70s and 80s, when the low impedance fencers came into use, basically from New Zealand, fencing technology really came up. And the beauty of these low impedance fencers is that they're very, very high energy, but they're low amperage. And what they do is that they put forth a lot of pain. And if you look closely at towards like the bottom 1/3 of the picture, you can see a high tensile wire. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the idea is that then you can move electricity quite easily, and you can pack a lot of pain, and you can train animals to this fence. And then because of that, you can reduce the cost of your fencing just exponentially. And so this is basically why we've got to really have an opportunity to make rotational grazing work. I got to say, I apologize. A little chat thing popped up, and it startled me so much I lost my train of thought. But it was talking about the dense hedgerows in France, and indeed, they did work, but it made it really tough for making paddock changes, etc. But certainly was something of it. Just as an aside, some of you might curse multiflora rose, but multiflora rose was introduced in the United States as the idea of a hedgerow and a living fence. It didn't work out so well. But anyway, so we need to have a fencer. We need to have a good fencer, and they need to install it correctly. And we can go, installing fencers are relatively easy. Just follow the directions. We can talk about the why. But the long and the short of it is that if you don't have a fencer properly grounded, the fencer does no good. You will not be able to shock the animal. And that's one of the reasons that many people say, well, electric fencers don't work in the winter. Electric fencers will work in the winter if you've got proper grounding and if there isn't too much dry snow. But other than that, you can make them work, and they're tremendously effective. But so the real short thing that I'll go with tonight in the effort of time is just follow the directions. If they say to put in 3 ground rods 8 feet deep, 10 feet apart, connected with copper wire or galvanized wire or whatever they tell you to do it, and you'll have good success. Just a real aside, that Gallagher fencer has been blown up, even with all of the stuff that we have for the lightning arresters and all the rest of the stuff. It's been blown up twice or 3 times now in 30 years. But each time we've had it repaired, and that thing is still going strong. It was originally, that was our entire fencer for our entire farm. Since my son has taken over, he's decided he didn't want to have quite so much of all of his eggs in one basket. Now we have actually 3 different fencers, 3 different zones on the farm, and the M800 is actually the smallest one that we have. So, spend some money, get yourself a good fencer, follow the directions, and then let's get some fence up. So on the next slide, I just want to talk. So what do you want to fence around? Well, you can see I've got some fence posts there, and I have a mighty dog there making sure everything's going. Well, we got to plant some stuff. And years ago, when we talked about grazing, I mean, for 30 years, I've been following this discussion, and I'd have to say that there is no such thing as a perfect grass. There's no such thing as a perfect legume. There's no such thing as a perfect forb. There are mixtures that will work better than others, and those mixtures will work better in certain instances, certain soil types, geographic areas, latitudes. Stuff that grows very well up by Ashland doesn't necessarily grow very well down by Platteville, and vice versa. And so those are the things we have to take a look at. And it seems like every year, there's some seed company that they've got the newest, the best, the greatest. And if you but plant this, all of your problems will be solved. And the old saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it isn't true. and that's the same thing with all these grasses. So what I would say is having some type of a mixture is good. I think monocultures are most of the time dangerous. But I got to be a little bit careful on that. There might be certain applications where it works. I generally like to have 2 or 3 different species mixed together. I generally like to have 1 legume in there. And it could be a clover, it could be birds foot trefoil, it could be alfalfa, it could be, but something that's going to be a nitrogen fixer for you, and maybe some drought resistance. On this particular picture, we're on a hillside. It happens to be a south-facing slope. The sun's behind me, and you can see there's some alfalfa in there. We've got a few weeds. We've got some ryegrass in there. There's some orchard grass, and there's also some clover. And on this particular field, the clover happens to be Kira clover. And let's not get too caught up on the various clovers. All of them have pros and cons, but I think that they can be very good. Years ago, a colleague of mine and good friend who retired many years, John Cockrell, was a grazing advocate and an extension agent, but he was very, very dismissive of alfalfa in grazing. Now, I'll admit that alfalfa, after 3, 4, 5 years, the bulk of it will have died. But I think alfalfa should be something that should be in a mix in almost all of our situations. Now, I realize that up in the clover belt, the marsh field, that's central, some of the wetter soils, maybe more clover would be the thing. But the thing that I really love about alfalfa, deep-rooted system, if you're in a drought, that stuff is dynamite, and it can really save your bacon. So we have to take a look at our soils. We have to take a look at what species that we want to graze, and then we have to take a look at planting some of our grasses and our legumes and how we want to do it. And my suggestion to start out with is to start out simple, no more than, 3 or at the very most 4 different species per paddock to start with. And then you can add and subtract and do things differently. And then the other thing, unless you have just a really small acreage, 10, 15 acres, I would strongly suggest that you don't plant the same thing on everything. And so, for instance, on our farm, we have about three really distinct zones or differences where I've planted different mixtures with the idea that those mixtures will have a chance of surviving and thriving when the others may not. So the stuff that I plant that would be in the valleys and in the lower ground, it's a different mix, definitely a different mix than what I have on my south-facing slopes, and then what I have on the north-facing slopes on this farm. Now, you may not have topography like that on your farm, but it's certainly something to think about. That even if you have a relatively uniform piece of ground, you might want to think about doing different things, with it, and with different species. But I'm going to come back and hammer again on the idea that there's no such thing as a perfect species for both the grass or the legumes or the clovers. There's many different ones, and they all have pros and cons. Though the one thing I will say, though, is that if you're looking for an opportunity to really improve things, where you purchase your seed, and I don't care who you purchase it from. Could be private treaty, could be from a seed company or whatever. But buy good seed, good viable seed. There's nothing more frustrating than to think that you've gone out and for certain folks, maybe they've tilled up something, maybe they've used chemicals to prepare the area for seed, etc. Spent the money to get the seed into the ground, and then you have a really poor germination, a poor start. So make darn sure that you get good seed when you're going to bother to spend money. Now, if we can take a look at the next slide. This is the start. So when we started back in 1993, now I'm going to say right first off, this is not 1993. This is actually about 1997, 98. It took us a few years to get the sward even as good as this. And if you take a look at it, it's not bad. And I'll have to say, did I pick the very best picture I could find from that year? Well, you're darn right I did. So, but the point is that this was a start, and this particular paddock had good fertility. It was upland. This is a north-facing slope. A lot of things are going right here, and this is what we want to see. We want to see a good thick sward. We want to have the cattle being able to graze it down. And I can critique this now 20 some years later. I can see, well, it looks to me like we should have made that paddock a little bit smaller, maybe we grazed it just a little bit more uniformly, etc. But this is a start. And if you look in the background, that's all of our farm. And those are actually different paddocks. If you can kind of see the lines. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. You can see the lines up there, so you can see the different. We basically fenced on the contour in 300-foot strips, and then so that those strips are permanent. That would be the high tensile wire, and then we would use poly wire to break it into the individual paddocks in the various sizes. And one of the things that we did, that the majority of our paddocks do not have gates. So we have lanes for the cattle to go back and forth. But instead of having a gate, we use either a piece of PVC or a board to open up. so that we can have an infinite variable number of paddocks to make things go. But getting back to the basic grazing thing, so we had to have fencing. We had to plant this. And if you remember right, I mentioned earlier that when we bought this farm, it was all corn and soybeans, and it was some of that infamous 320-day corn that was on the farm. That entire hillside behind that cow right there, that was all standing corn that hadn't been harvested. And anyway, we had to seed it all down. So this was a good start, and I think, so we made sure that we had soil tests. We made sure there was good fertility. We used certified clean seed. We used a good no-till drill, and we got things going. And had it not been for doing those things, we wouldn't have had this kind of paddock. However, while this is good, things can get better. And if I remember right, if I got these slides in the order, yeah, I did. So let's fast forward another 20 years. This is not the exact same spot. It's actually about 500 feet east of where I took that other picture. But you can see a high tensile wire, and you can see yep, thank you. There's a high tensile wire, just one single wire with 6,000 volts going through there. And you can see our cows have changed a little bit. Before, that first cow you can see was pretty typical Holstein, and now we're running a three-way cross: New Zealand Holstein, New Zealand Jersey, and Scandinavian Red. And so we got a lot of different colors. And if you can look, you can see behind we got it. Well, what I wanted to point out in this particular picture was that now things are a little bit different here. Definitely different sward density, have got different height. And now if we were in a situation where we could go back and forth from the classroom or talk back and forth, I'd ask, well, why? Isn't this too tall of a grazing? Well, or having the the sward too high before we turn the cattle into it? Possibly. The thing of it is, though, this is a totally different species now that's in this paddock. Before, you were looking at an orchard grass, ryegrass mix up there on the hill on the previous slide. What you're looking at here is almost like an 80% reed canary and about 20% Cura clover paddock. And one of the things that you have to do with reed canary, you have to graze it a little higher to make things work. And I know that for some people, I'll just digress here. I know for some people, reed canary is an evil word. I remember working with some wildlife specialists, and they were just like, well, reed canary is an invasive species. It's really tough on wetlands. And I acknowledge all those things. It is. It's an invasive species. Well, but it invasive 400 years ago. So I don't know. Maybe they're going to get over it. But it doesn't matter. What does matter is that in certain spots, reed canary is a wonderful grass species to have. Deep-rooted, relatively palatable, good tonnage. Doesn't do particularly well in late drought situations, except for because of the deep roots. It actually does pretty good on that. But if you get super high heat, it will shut down. But that's why I have about 30 or 40 acres of just basically reed canary and Cura because of that. So that's kind of part of my drought insurance, along with some of the alfalfa mixes that we have. But this comes back to figuring out what you want to do, with your cattle. So if we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to show you, this is again looking, up the hill or down the hill into the valley. The valley is some of our best stuff. I've got some rocky outcrops, and you can see here, these are some heifers and thistles. And so it isn't always all sunshine and roses. And I just want to make sure that you understand that. I mean, management, you can do all kinds of things. We've clipped thistles, we've spot sprayed thistles over the years. We've done lots of different things, and all of those things have helped. But you are going to have some plants come up that you're not going to want. And remember, a weed is simply a plant out of place. You know, in the right place, those thistles could be a wonderful thing. It could be a crop. It's not what we want in our paddocks. But my point is that even if you're doing many things right, you can still have some of these issues. But it's certainly doable, and we can make things work quite well. But you shouldn't throw up your hands and say, well, I can't do anything. We can, and I think I've got some later pictures that we got rid of those thistles, but it does take some time. And I always tell people, you know, you've got to have some type of a realistic expectation on what's going on out there. But the and part about it is that if you're a grazing farm and you're harvesting sunshine and you're feeding those animals, you're doing your job, and then you've got an opportunity to change the composition of the population of what you got out there. So let's take a look at the next slide, please. One of the things that I do want to say is that if you've got an opportunity to have some trees in your paddock, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do with trees in the paddock, and there's nothing wrong with having some trees in. The thing you got to remember, though, is that a tree can be a weed also. It can be a plant out of place. And one of the things that we've got to be careful on is that we want to have a very uniform distribution of urine and manure throughout our paddock. And generally in the latitudes that we're working on, you know, here in Minnesota and Wisconsin, you know, generally heat is not our biggest issue. Now, I realize we can have some really hot days, and we can even have hot weeks. And I remember a couple of weeks, I can't remember the specific year, it seemed to me it was in the 90s, that we had like 3 or 4 weeks where it was like 100 and something every day. And so you can have those issues. So it's really important to have some shade and have some other stuff that you can get to. Careful on how you're utilizing this shade, and because if you want to have a uniform distribution of manure and urine, those shade places are a magnet to bring the cattle, and when they get in there, then they have an opportunity to urinate and defecate, and you get tremendous loads, nutrient loads built up there to the detriment of the rest of your paddocks. So be a little careful on how you utilize that. We do have shade paddocks, but we only use them when there's some really hot weather, and we manage the animals so that, you know, we know when they're in there, and so there's a bunch of things to do. And one of the things I get a little concerned about, I've been on a couple different grazing farms, and I know on with Lynn Johnson's grazing group up there, they talk about some of their with their silvopasture, basically taking a look at forestry and pasturing and some other things. All of those things can be done, but you have to, there are some other caveats, and we can get into some of those, but just suffice it to say, it's great to have some shade, but be careful on how you use it because of, like I say, the manure and urine distribution. So if I could have the next slide. That kind of segues into watering systems. Now, this is the first watering system that we had, and this was back in 1993, 94, and it worked. We were milking about 100 cows back then, and then, of course, we were bringing them up, milking them twice a day. So we had water at the buildings, and we had this little half of a 55-gallon barrel, and it worked perfectly. It worked very well. A lot of maintenance, though. A lot of things would go around. Hoses would break. Gophers would chew through our plastic pipe. I cannot understand what a gopher would like to be eating on a plastic pipe, but I've seen it done. The point, though, is that for dairy, we've gone away from having water out in the paddocks for our milk cows. We just don't feel that the juice is worth the squeeze. So we water the cattle when they come up for milking. But for our dry cows and our heifers and our beef herd, we need water out in the paddock. And if those are the species you're going to be grazing, that's what you need. You need to have some type of a water system out there. And the water system doesn't have to be elaborate, but it has to be adequate. And one of the things that is really great is there's been some tremendous research done over the years in giving you what an adequate system will be. Now, first, let me just say that I have deep and abiding respect for the design criteria that my former colleagues in NRCS used to come up with. Those are great systems. They work, and they work well. They are also relatively expensive, and you can do things a little bit different with some different management things. However, if you're looking at cost sharing, if you're going to be taking cost sharing from any of the agencies, you must follow their recommendations. And the good news is that their recommendations are really, really, really top notch. The bad news is that they're also very, very expensive. And of course, the good news is you're getting cost sharing on it. The bad news is, a lot of money. But what I will say is that, there are certain things that you can take a look at. And the one piece of research that I go to quite often is that my good friend, Jim Garish, who was a researcher from Missouri, did some really nice work on beef cattle and about herd temperament and how cattle go to drink and what you have to have. And you can go back and take a look at his research. And the long and the short of it says that basically if cattle can see each other and it's about 800 feet for them to get to a water source, the cattle will go and drink at the water source with onesies and twosies. That's kind of their herd mentality. I mean, you got to remember that the cattle are ice age creatures, and their brain BB, even though there hasn't been a saber-toothed tiger around for 10,000 years, their brain BB still says there might be a saber-toothed tiger hiding in the grass over there. And so as long as they can see their buddies, they can see the herd, they'll go and they'll drink as individuals or with one or two, three. But if they got to go over a hill and they can't see their buddies and it's a longer distance, then they will go as a herd. And I'll guarantee you, if I had 100 mature dairy cattle mobbing this 50-gallon or half of a 50-gallon tank, it just wouldn't work. So anyway, the point being is if we design things right, you can get by with a relatively small watering system and it can work. And if you're using beef or sheep, goats, meat goats, the thing of it is that you don't need lanes, you need a watering system. And we'll talk about that later. I mean, you can do all kinds of different things, but I mean, we've got to get fencing, we got to get grass growing, and then we got to figure out a management system so that we can keep those cattle on the grass or keep those animals, whether it be cattle, sheep, goats, whatever, bison, you got to keep them on the grass and drinking water out there so that you can have that uniform manure and urine distribution. And one of the Kissa's deaths, one of the worst setups I've ever seen in my life was, let's have 7 or 8 shade trees with a watering system there, and let's put the salt lick there. So where do you think about 99.9% of the urine and the manure is? Well, it would be up in that area. And if the cattle or the whatever you're grazing continue to go back there, that's where you're going to have it. So getting a watering system out there, and my good friend Jim Munch from Coon Valley, Wisconsin, who's a tremendous grazer and has done a great job. I fought with him for years and years and years to get him to install a watering system. He had a watering system up by the buildings. The cattle always came back. And while he did a good job of grazing, I could see that part of his issue was that nutrient distribution on the paddock. Anyway, make a long story short, about 10 years ago or so, maybe it's 15 now, but he finally changed and he put a little watering system out. And I mean, within a couple of years, you could just see a pronounced difference in his paddocks. Now, his paddocks were good to begin with, but it's the good is the enemy of the best. And so by making things better, but having a watering system so that you can keep the cattle out there, that's very important. Now, having said that, to begin with, maybe you don't have the money to do this. You say, well, I want to utilize, I can bring them back to the buildings, or I got a crick. Okay, let's use that. And have the idea that you are going to get away from that so that you can have more uniform urine and manure distribution later on. So if I can see the next slide, please. So we have lanes. This is one of the first lanes that we built. This lane is no more. We've changed where we put things, but for us, wheeling our cattle around is very important. And we've got uphills, downhills, and unlike what Kevin has got over there by his area, we don't have quite the mud issues that you have, but we have hill issues. And so we have to build zigzag lanes, but lanes are very important for wheeling cattle around. I'm looking at the effort of time. Let's just go to the next slide. This is my good friend, Roger Dahlberg. This is an NRCS project. Those are interlocking stone pavers that's going through that creek. This is absolutely the Cadillac of systems. If you have creeks that are going through your property, Roger decided to go with this. But there are other methodologies that you can use. And there's nothing wrong with having the cattle drink from a creek as long as it's a controlled methodology, and you can do that. This, like I said, this one was a cost shared unit, but so we can use creeks and we can get cattle through them, no problem. Let's see the next slide. So here is a picture of, this is very close to where you saw that one Holstein cow up on the hill. This is probably about 300 or 400 feet, and maybe about 10 or 12 years later. So you can see a little difference and change in the sward. But actually three things that I want to point out here. You can see that we've got some hay feeding that had been going on, winter feeding. And then if you look, yeah, thank you. You can see some of that. And some people get really, really kind of bent around the wheel that, this is, I don't know, it's some type of a terrible management to have some hay there. Well, the waste I don't particularly like, but you can use it for bedding. The other part of it, though, of course, it does add organic matter. And it doesn't take, if you've got good biological activity in the soil, good earthworms, etc., it doesn't take long to break down this stuff. And so that's very important. If you look on the bottom left corner, you can see a little yellow poly wire going through. And we use poly wire all over the place, and it's kind of important. I've heard people tell me that, well, I can get by with 16 gauge or 18 gauge, smooth wire, and I can do that. And maybe you can, but you can't do it very efficiently and effectively. So, let's talk about using some of the good technology. And then in the center there, you see the white stake, and then attached to the white stake, there's a grazing stick. And that's just a management tool. And I think I've got the next slide. I think I've got a bigger picture of that grazing stick. So for those of you who are not familiar, there's several different outfits that put out grazing sticks. I know Grassworks in conjunction working with Organic Valley and other folks, we've put together a grazing stick, and NRCS has got grazing stick. The long and the short of it is it's just basically a ruler with some rules of thumb. But this comes back to management. So once you've got your, you've got your property fenced, you've got some grasses and legumes growing on it, you figured out some species, you're going to need to do some management. And using a grazing stick can help you. And it's not very complicated. And we've got some rules of thumb. And people say, well, I don't need this. And no, you don't. However, it can be very helpful. So I would strongly suggest that if you haven't got one, if you're going to start out, get yourself a grazing stick. There's all kinds of good information on there. And by learning what that information is telling and what you need to look for, you'll gain a lot of management skills. So if I could have the next slide. The other thing that this is Lynn Johnson and I were talking about this the other day. There's many different ways that you can put together something. But if you're going to have your own cattle, or if you're going to have other people's cattle, you're going to have, or whatever species would be, goat, sheep, bison, you're going to have something that you have to collect them, because you're going to have some veterinarian work. You might need to have some management, ear tags, etc. But it doesn't have to be complicated, and it doesn't have to be exceedingly expensive. But this is one of the nicest and simplest little corrals that I've seen. And it's got 2 gates on it. It's got these wooden posts. And yes, this is a little bit of expense. Oh yeah, you can put some together with T-posts, and you can put stuff together with cattle panels, etc. And if you've been, handling your animals, all those things. But I'll tell you what, if you're going to do this for a few years, put something like that together. And then the other thing, the Seversons put this one together, and then they put a gate in one of the corners, so that basically it's a glorified maternity pen is what it is. But you can put maybe 20 or 30 head if you really had to in there, and get ready to put them on a trailer. So you're going to need to have some facilities to work those animals. And this is just one simple thing. A little bit of expense, yes, but well worth it. Next slide, please. There's other things we can do. This is again a picture of our herd down in the valley, and that's grazing corn that you're seeing. And that's like I said, we do not plant crops for harvesting by mechanical means. We harvest it with our animals. And so you can use annuals. There's nothing wrong with annuals in certain places. And what we generally do is, by looking at our soil test and looking at where we'd like to have different species of grasses, legumes, etc., we'll maybe do a little bit of tillage, or we'll use chemical and then no-till into it. And we'll have some of the annuals. And again, for dairy cattle, I mean, we've got a whole different situation than what you would have with beef or any of the meat species. We're chasing that damn lactation curve. But this can work very well. And just as an aside, this was drilled in at 6-inch row spacing with a conventional drill and conventional tillage down here in the bottom in the flat land, and at about 130,000 population, and it was all bin run seed. And yes, Kevin, you're right. It was not any GMO, because if it would have been GMO, they could put me in jail, which I would not like. So we can use some annuals, and then again, by using the poly wire, etc., we can make sure that works. Let's see. I see that we've gone through our hour. Can I continue for a little while, or should I've got a few more slides here. Otherwise, we could stop and take questions now, Mary. Whatever you'd like to do.
I think unless somebody pipes up in the next 30 seconds, they could unmute themselves and say, please stop. I would say that we continue. You're not too far down the road from being done.
Yeah, I don't have too terrible anymore, but okay, as long as that's okay with everybody, we'll just continue with it. So if I can have the next slide. So again, and this is another annual, and this happens to be turnips and oats. And you can see a bunch of different things going on here. I just wanted to kind of unpack them a little bit. You can see that the cattle are heading down a lane. So there's a lane that they're heading down. They've been in the turnips and the oats, and they've basically pulled the turnips out of the ground and ate them, and they've eaten the oats. You can see the poly wire on the right side. That was the temporary divider, and you can see how well that they've cleaned things up, and they've cleaned underneath the wire. What we do is we drive. Yep, thank you. We drive down the oats with the four-wheeler, and then we just stick the little posts in. The other thing I wanted to show is that we also were pre-positioning some bales for a bunch of different things. If we take a look on the up there, and those bales, that was such a hot ration for our dairy cows. We had to get some other fiber in them, and so there would be bale feeders, bale rings that will go around those later, but they're positioned out there for the next day. So there's 3 or 4 things going on here, and then at the very center you see that wooden post, and you can see a black insulator on it, and that's a pin lock insulator. And that's one of the things that we've done on every single wooden post that we have on the farm. We've got pin lock insulators, and a pin lock is simply, it basically has 2 prongs sticking out, and then you can basically put a piece of wood or a piece of plastic is what they come with, and you can drop the wire or lift the wire. And so then we don't have to worry about having gates, because one of the things, if you have a gate area, and the cattle always go through the same place, well, you're going to have a mud situation. And that's why, unless you have wheeled traffic, so that you need to have something going through in a certain place, then we kind of want to go with the pin locks. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about goats just a little bit. Goats, wonderful animals. These happen to be dairy goats. I've ran into a whole bunch of people who've told me that you can't graze goats. I'm a little confused on that. I've also heard that you can't keep goats inside of a high tensile fence, that you need to have woven wire. Well, this is an acquaintance of mine over in Vernon County, and they milk about 400 goats, and they're all on pasture, and it's all high tensile wire keeping them in. Now, occasionally, do 1 or 2 of them slip through? Yep, but they've been doing it for 8 or 9 years, and just an excellent way to do it. The other thing that's kind of interesting, if you look closely at this picture, the particular species mix, there's a lot of alfalfa in here, and a lot of the goat producers were telling me, well, goats won't eat alfalfa. Well, that could be true, but these goats will eat alfalfa. So just remember, whatever species you want to have it, and there's nothing wrong with mixed species. Some people say, you can, for every 10 cows, you can have 1 goat mixed in with the herd, and then basically they will eat the forbs and other stuff that the cattle don't eat, and you basically have a free lunch. So nothing wrong with mixing the species. Let's have another slide. Yeah, just real quickly, just showing, we got to have some winter feed. I'm just showing some, I think there was some chicory planted in this, along with some oats and some other things. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, years ago we used to harvest some corn silage on our property, and we've discontinued doing that. But you're going to need winter feed, and corn silage can be a good thing, but generally it's better to buy it from somebody else and screw around with it yourself. But if you want to, it can be done. Let's go to the next slide. We use piles, and then we have over the years, and then after in the winter time, then we just feed from the piles. So if you look at the next slide, that's just some of the winter feeding, and again, just using a poly wire, and fiberglass posts, able to get those cattle fed. All right, let's see. I think there's a couple more slides left. So yeah, so in conclusion, this is, surround yourself with positive people if you can. Attend pasture walks and grazing conferences. Subscribe to magazines and newsletters that, if that trips your trigger. I should have updated this thing, go to all the Zoom and Voom or whatever meetings you can. And if you haven't heard of the Graze magazine, that's a wonderful magazine. The Stockman Grass Farmer is okay, but they got a lot of South and centric articles, whereas the Graze is more Midwest and Northeast centric a little bit. So set realistic goals and try to measure them, and share what you love to do with somebody else. Give them a call, do whatever, and yeah, get on the phone, talk with people. So I think there's about 3 more slides, and I do want to run through those since we're here. Oh, yeah, go the other way. Okay, this is just a fun one. This is our parlor. This is one of our cows. I always like sharing this. Talk about mellow. That cow didn't really, she was thinking about jumping over, but why not? I guess I'll just get milked. And so that's just kind of a fun shot. And if I could have the next slide. Good. Yeah, good for you. All right. Next slide, please. This is just, Bonnie took this, and then, yeah, that's the end. So now we got time for questions and comments and all kinds of stuff.
Yes, and I would ask if anyone has a question, they can unmute and ask away.
Hi, this is Jean. I listed as Barb up there, my wife.
Okay. Hi, Jean.
Hi. I'm planning to start grazing this within the next year.
Okay.
And so and I've got established grasses. If I want to improve the species, what's the best way to do that, or a way?
Yeah, well, the obvious answer is you add seed. Okay, that's the really simple answer. Then the $94,000 question is, how do you add seed so that it works? So one of the things need to know is, what are you thinking about adding? So for instance, red clovers, or and most of the clovers, but red clover in particular, a really great thing just to add over the top. We can frost seed that, we can just throw it on top, and if there's some bare spots, red clover will jump up. But if you're looking at different grasses, the only grass that I'm familiar with that has any kind of a chance of having just an overseeding without any other work would be some of your ryegrasses. But even those wouldn't be huge. So then you're going to have to do, how are you going to get a seed to soil interface? So, there's different ways to do that, and all of them have pros and cons. One of the things I always ask, are you, if you're organic, you don't have any chemical, well, you have very limited chemical options. And so, one of the things is you can suppress some of the grasses with some chemical options, and then you can use like a no-till drill. And that'd be my favorite, and it's also the most expensive. But it will get you it'll get you results that are relatively quick, depending on how fast you need to get different species. You can put seed out, either ahead of a grazing, and then make the paddock, maybe half the size that you normally do, so that you can pound the seed into the ground with hoof action. So there's lots of different ways you can do it, but the and part is that how successful, what percentage of that seed will grow, and then how fast it will get going. That's really important to get that seed to soil contact. I mean, for instance, we used to talk about, and I know some people who've done it, they would add certain seed, generally red clover or clover seed, to their mineral mixes. And then, the cattle would ingest it, and then they would defecate, and then they would use that. And it works, but my God, is it low and slow, and you lose about 95% of your seed. And so, is that really a cost-effective way to do it? So anyway, those are some things you can do. What were you thinking, Gene?
I was thinking I need to. I mean, these grasses have been there for 40 years.
Okay.
So they're well established, and they match the soils and climate and all that kind of stuff. So whatever, it's going to be tough competition for any new seed that I would put in.
Right.
And while I'm not organic per se, I don't like to use glyphosate except under duress.
Sure.
Again,
And that's perfectly understandable. And again, you could rough up the sod a little bit. I mean, you could use a tillage, a very light tillage, like a disc or something like that, and then come in after that sod has been lightly disked. Then by using like a no-till drill that would have a seed, a disc opener for it. Also, it happens that the Atchison no-till drills, they're designed for sod, and so they have a shovel type. Basically, it's a shovel, or you can think of it as maybe a mini spear or whatever. But basically, that's used to get the seed in there, and it's a little more aggressive. And I don't know what part of the state or states you're from, but I know that down in our area in southern Wisconsin, there's a couple different Atchison drills and available for rent for grazers. And there used to be, I think out of Wausau, I think they used to have one that they rented out too, so that you could actually go into sod. You wouldn't have to use chemical, though again, it's going to reduce it will not make it as well established, or easy to make things established. But again, as long as you're willing to put up with that, I have very mixed feelings about using glyphosate. I try to use as little as possible for various reasons. And so that's something to think about. And Kevin mentioned about frost seeding. Oops. Okay, come back. You're here. And you for the legumes, you can get that done. But what I would say is that I always think about short-term damage. So I mean, if you choose to use chemicals to help things get established, and you're going to get a sod that's going to be lasting you for 15 or 20 years or even 10 years, I mean, I think that's a tremendously good environmental trade-off. However, you can do it without it too.
Yeah, and this has been in grasses for the 40 years because it's hilly. I mean, I'm up here. Our area is called the Knapp Hills. It's just west of Menominee, and it's kind of the edge of the drift list. So it's nothing that I like to run my equipment on, and I don't feel comfortable driving a tractor.
Yeah, well, and I don't blame you. I've got some hills here that I will not run equipment on. My son will, but I won't. And so, yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think that probably in the 30s they ran horses on it, and they could handle it, but it's not worth it.
Yeah,
So-
right. No, I know. And for those sort of places, then, talking about frost seeding or overseeding, just going out there with a broadcasting seed, and then bringing the cattle in so that they can trample, those are a viable ways, but you're going to have to, it's going to be quite a bit more seed that's going to have to be going on there, because like you say, the competition is that old well-established sod. And again, there's nothing wrong necessarily with that old established sod. It might be really good stuff, and it might be just worthless crap too. I mean, it depends on how the management was done for there on those things, but at least it's holding the soil.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You bet, Gene.
Okay, we do have some questions about what grasses are. It's hard to beat up bluegrass sod. What grasses can we use, and how do we beat it out without extra intervention?
Well, if I understand the question, we're asking about a bluegrass sod. Generally, bluegrass sod indicates that there's been some fairly low grazing. I mean, bluegrass. I mean, there are commercially developed bluegrass varieties that are for grazing, but most of the stuff around here, bluegrass is what comes on after things have been grazed low and hard, and generally too much. And often I see an awful lot of that when I work with folks that have mixed species and horses. Horses are generally part of the mix that can cause a lot of problems. Not because horses in and of themselves are something wrong with horses. It's just their physiology. I mean, the way that their teeth are put together, they can graze a lot shorter than what cows can, because cows basically, they take their tongue and they wrap around the forage and pull it in their mouth, whereas horses literally can nibble off an eighth of an inch coming out of the ground. But bluegrass isn't particularly tough to do damage to. I mean, a little tillage with that, can really set bluegrass back. It's a very shallow rooted system. So, when it's dry, I think a late summer seeding generally can do a lot of damage to bluegrass. Maybe with just a little bit of tillage, if you're willing to use some chemicals, you can hit it with a little bit of glyphosate, burn her back, or you can do some other burn back stuff. But I generally like to use a late summer seeding to do some of that damage, because if you get the rains, then your seeds will come on strong, and you've already the bluegrass is already stressed.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Rachel was wondering the grasses that Gene has.
Yeah, what's already established there.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a good question. After 40 years, and if it's on a hillside, it just depends on how it was managed. So Gene, are you still on? Do you know what species you have out there?
No, it's
okay.
It's green.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, But I think where Rachel was going with that question is that, you know, do you really need to change the species that you have out there, or if by changing the management, you know, can you achieve what you want? And so I'm not exactly. Are you looking for more tonnage? Are you you know? Do you think you just need a change, or why are you looking to make things different there? I guess I think that would be the question.
Well, among other things, there are very few legumes in there. I mean, not much clover.
Sure.
The variety I have in there is was it the Canada goldenrod or Canadian goldenrod, whatever, which is that nasty stuff. But it's, you know.
Yeah. Well. So definitely, you know, if you've got a lot of goldenrod out there, and if you've got a lot of different, you know, different weeds or plants out of place, which are weeds, yeah, and the legumes. But you know, if you're looking just for the legumes, you know, I think Kevin mentioned about frost seeding, and frost seeding is a great thing. We might not have it. It might be a little bit late for frost seeding, but on the other hand, if we got some timely rains, I mean, you could go out there and sprinkle 1 or 2, you know, even up to 3 pounds of clover out there, and you might get a decent catch. And I haven't priced clover lately, but I know it had been going up in price. But still, you know, 1 or 2 pounds will get you. I think on red clover, I think we're looking at 250,000 seeds per pound. So, you know, I think it's worth a try, and it wouldn't, you know, a couple bucks an acre, and then you could even use a hand spreader, or if you got a 4-wheeler, you can put a spreader on the back. That's the way I kind of like to do it, you know, to get the seed out there.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Great discussion here. Are there any other questions?
Mary, there's a question in the chat from Wilmer.
Okay, there we go. Vance, what are good combinations to complement wet soil? Reed canary grass, a lot of acres. I have soils that aren't tillable and are an assortment of sedges and rushes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's always a challenge. So yeah, I saw there was a couple different questions on reed canary. And so, you know, reed canary, very, very fine seed. I mean, physically, you look at it, it's small. It doesn't have a lot of seedling vigor. It will tolerate wet soils, but it actually really, really likes moderately drained soils, and because of that deep root system. But it can tolerate wet stuff. A little bit difficult to get established. And when you have sedges and you have other things, generally we have some other issues going on there. You know, generally there's some pH issues, at least where I've worked at, because most of ours, where there would be sedges and other things, would be in kind of in the valleys and some of the other stuff. But so, you know, definitely that would be a, you know, reed canary would be definitely something to think about, to have in there. A problem comes in, like I say, is the establishment, because you need to somehow get rid of the competition for reed canary. And I know a lot of people say, well, good God, you know, it grows everywhere. And, you know, well, yeah, it does. But it's like, well, when you have a billion seeds, you know, you only need to have a small percentage of the seedlings live in order for it to get a lot going on. The other thing to remember is that, you know, the reed canary that we see that grows wild since the 1600s, generally has high alkaloids. And so we would like to have an improved variety of reed canary that has been bred to reduce the alkaloids, and it's just making it less bitter, and the cattle like to eat it a little bit better. So we need to. So if you have existing reed canary, more often than not, that's something you probably want to get rid of. I mean, if it was volunteer reed canary. So, but when it comes back to establishment, having some type of a tilled area, or suppressing tilled and chemical, either one or both, so that you can reduce the competition. That's one of the best ways to get things done. It's very, I have never seen it successfully done, establishing reed canary without some type of suppression or tillage. So broadcasting, I've never seen it work for a grazing field. Now, if you have some small areas that are mucked up or whatever, and then because of trampling or other things, maybe around a water tank or whatever, maybe you could get something established there. But again, once the seedling comes up, you got to protect that seedling for the first year. You really can't let a lot of things go on it. So that's kind of where I'm going for that. And for the wetter soils, obviously, our clovers for a legume work really well. They can tolerate a lot of wet soil. And then, like I say, the reed canary is a real good thing. I like the reed canary Cura combination. Cura clover is kind of hard to come by, but the nice part about it is if you get it established and you manage it correctly, you can have Cura and reed last for 30, 40 years. And there's some plots at the Arlington Research Station, outside of Madison. They got a Cura clover plot that's over 100 years old, and they know from genetic testing, etc., that those plants have survived, and so it's something that we should certainly think about. There are others that will tolerate some wet feet. I mean, some of our cool season grasses, but if you've got sedges and other things growing there, oh, I tell you, that is a tough one. But one of the things I would certainly check on, too, is make sure you get a soil test on that, just to see where you're at, because sometimes fertility could be part of the issue, and where the sedges I'm trying to think of the other. You got the one that they're the round stem, and the one that's a triangular, and I can't think of the difference now.
Have edges and rushes are.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. Thank you. And sometimes you can correct, or you can change some of your species mix just by changing changing the fertility, and the pH is one thing. Though the one thing I'll caution you on, of course, is that changing the pH is relatively difficult if you can't incorporate your liming, or your material, generally lime, though you can use other products too, but lime is the one that we generally talk about. If you can't incorporate it, basically, if you put fine limestone, lime on the surface, it neutralizes about 1/10 of an inch per year. That's how. So I mean, it can do some good, but it takes a long time. And there's no magic. There is absolutely no magic bullet. Like I said, I was an extension for 33 years, and I saw all kinds of products come and go, and they would have this magic foo-foo dust, and you could throw this, and they would, the long and the short of it is that in order to make lime work well, you have to incorporate it so that it physically touches other soil particles, and that then you can get things neutralized in a relatively quick manner. It will, like I said, about 1/10 of an inch or so. It'll go on its own. But if you can't till it, yeah, it's a really difficult thing. So then you should really, with a soil test, then you should be taking a look and see, yeah, because if you're under like a 5.5 pH, it's going to make it really difficult for a lot of things to grow. That's getting down to even where clover says, I'm not really sure I want to mess with this. Though if moisture isn't the issue, some of our grasses, almost all of our cool season grasses, can take it down to about 5 on a pH. So those are some things to think about.
Okay, yeah, because biggest thing I have is majority of my acreage that is grazable is on wetter soils, and pretty much for the growing season, about July and August is about the only time that I would feel safe even attempting to drive a
Right.
large piece of equipment out there.
Yep.
And without causing ruts or anything like that. And I guess with everything that I'm trying to do, I mean, I'm also trying to use hogs and whatnot in my whole farming scheme. Would it be, instead of using conventional tillage for everything, would it be something where I take a larger section of pasture and then create smaller paddocks with the pigs and have them for a season go through and root it all up real good and apply the lime, and then after they're done for the year, go back through and then drag it, because of obviously it's with it being rooted up and whatnot, it's going to be clumpy and uneven.
Yep.
Or
Yeah, well, the short answer is pigs do a wonderful job of tillage. It's a lot of work, and there's some management things going on there, but no, any way you can get the job done. So you don't have to use iron, you don't have to use steel. You can use snouts. That would work. It certainly takes some time, and there's some different things going on there, but no, I can't see anything wrong with that scenario. I mean, you're feeding grain or whatever to the hogs. I mean, they can get some insects from the soil. There's some roots that they can eat, so they'll gain a little bit, but the urine and the manure is there. No, it's slow, but hey, as my great grandfather Rodman said, "What's time to a pig?"
right. And I mean, I guess maybe, originally I asked about the combination to add. I was asking as what I could add to already established reed canary grass, because I've got one large pasture of mine that's probably 3/4 of it is a combination of mostly reed canary grass, a little bit of sedge that's come in there and rushes since I started grazing it a little heavier. And the reed canary grass, I mean, it works great, but the problem is there's always so much residue that they leave. They always leave, it seems to be about 18 inches of residue that just is up. It looks like by the time I get done, it looks like I have straw just standing out in the field by the time that they get done grazing it. Even
Right.
if it's 6 feet tall when I go and put them out there.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things, the positive part about it, I mean, you're keeping the reed canary alive. I mean, one of the things on reed canary is that, we have to graze it. We have to leave a lot more residual in order to make it work. So, I would say that if you could get out there and graze it when it's, maybe 24 to 30 inches, and then bring it down to maybe about 12 inches, then you could get some pretty outstanding quality for your for whatever species that you're grazing out there. Are you grazing beef mostly?
I'm actually just in the process of starting a beef herd. Most of what I have on here already is dairy crosses of
Okay.
a variety of heifers and bulls.
Okay, so, but you're not milking though, are you?
No, currently I am not.
Okay. Well, the one thing about the beef animals or meat animals is that we're taking a look at, there's compensatory gain, and so if you've got other paddock to put them in, I mean, you can let that reed canary get a little bit more mature. That's not the worst thing in the world. The and part about it is that when if it's up to 6 feet tall, then generally the quality is quite low. I can't remember off the top of my head. I used to know that, but it seems to me that it's getting in that area close to corn stalks and mature straw. But having said that, not the worst thing in the world. I would just say if you could get in just a little bit earlier, it would do two things. It would give your whatever class of livestock you've got out there just a little bit better quality. And then I think that you'd give the plant a little more chance to bush out and do some things. And from a physiological point of view, if you don't allow the plant to go to seed, you've got a better chance of getting some of the plant a better quality for your whatever species that you're grazing.
Okay. Yeah,
but yeah, reed canary is good. It'd be very difficult to add things into it if you've got an established reed canary thing. Not impossible, but pretty tough. I mean, reed canary does a pretty good job of smothering stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured by the way it always looks at after I've had the cattle go through it, is that it looks like somebody, other than the stems from the actual existing plants, it looks like a mat of hay is right underneath them stems, intertwined in them stems from, I don't know if it's from the residual from those current plants or if there's just that much residual from before I started grazing these pastures.
Yeah, it's probably some residual. That stuff breaks down fairly good. But the other thing you could think about, is depending on how many animals you can have out there. You could talk about making your paddock smaller and then having more animal intensity out there, and that can do a couple different things. You can increase the fertility fairly well, making sure that there's more manure and urine out there, and that the hoof action then does some stuff. Plus, as you make this paddocks relatively smaller, just the psychology of grazing those animals. They see one another. If they're relatively close, they'll take an extra bite. It's a really interesting phenomenon with cattle.
Okay, I'll have to try that this summer then.
Yeah, you might want to try that because I think that might give you a leg up.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, Vance, we also have a question about experience or insight on solar systems on sites without power for both water and fencing needs.
Sure. Well, the long and the short of it, first I'll talk about fencers. All fencers are powered the same way. So no matter if you have 110 volt, 220, 12 volt, 24 volt, eventually what goes into the fencer, when it goes into the trisistor, not a transistor, it's all the same. So however you energize that energizer, and that's a pun, but I did that deliberately, your output will be the same thing. So if they tell you it's going to be pounding out 6 joules or whatever it is, it doesn't matter whether it's electric, whether it's from coming off of the grid or whether it's coming off of solar. This is the and part. And when you are going to go with the solar and with a battery, generally that's generally what's done. The solar panel will get the battery. generally, in order to keep the costs down, the output in joules, which is the amount of power measured that gets pounded out through the fence, is generally smaller. So if you were going to have an equivalent fencer on the grid versus on the solar, you can do that, but generally the cost will be more. So the only thing I tell people is there's no difference as long as if the output is measured the same, doesn't make a dang bit of difference. The only thing that will generally, you take a look at a $300 or $400 fencer, if you can plug it into the wall. If you're looking on a solar fencer of equivalent size, you're probably looking at $600 or $700, maybe even $800. But there's no problem. They work great. Just don't be fooled into thinking that you can buy something really inexpensive, because you can buy some really inexpensive solar fencers, and they'll pound out something, but they really don't have a lot of they don't have equivalent power. So having said that, just make sure that you compare apples to apples. And there's a lot of really great solar batter powered fencers. Gallagher makes a lot of them. I took a whole potload of those down both to Nicaragua and Guyana and different places. And that was, yeah, they're good. You can get that. And talking about the watering systems, there's a whole bunch of different solar things that you can do on that. Again, some of the best systems that I have seen have come out of Canada, as far as for cost and for efficacy. But there's lots and lots of systems out there. But it just costs money. So if you're choosing not to be on the grid for various reasons, there's no problem with getting the technology to make those things work. The and part about it, though, is that it can get done, but it will be it can be more expensive. In the long run, maybe it'll be the same, but the upfront costs will definitely be but more. And you can take a look at surface pumping for the water, or I mean, if you got ponds or you got whatever, you can have tanks, etc. I mean, there's lots of different ways to do it, but the technology is there. It's just a matter of writing the bill. Did that answer the question?
Yes, it did. Thanks, Vance.
One thing I would like for you to touch on is the importance of a lightning arrestor. In the chat, there's a whole bunch of discussion about different types of fencers and whether they worked, whether they were not working. Okay, talk about lightning arresters.
Sure. If you take a look at any of the major energizers, companies that sell fencers, they'll talk about different methodology that you can put in for lightning arresting. And I guess the key point there is that you can buy commercial units that will arrest lightning. There's a whole bunch of things that in that picture that I showed of the Gallagher 800, that coil of wire that was in front, that's actually a choke. It's a lightning choke. And without getting too far in the weeds of the way electricity works, the long and the short of it is that because of the magnetic field, and when it goes through that coil, it actually produces a magnetic field. It will choke down most of the damage that a lightning strike will do. But as I think I indicated, we've still had that thing getting blown up 3 times. in 30 years. We've always been able to get it repaired. There are different types of lightning arresters, and there's nothing that I know of that will give you 100% protection. There might be something that could give you 100% protection, but it'd be so damn expensive that it wouldn't be worthwhile. So what I always tell people is take a look at what lightning arresters, whatever company, whatever brand you want to buy, use their lightning, put their technology in. Some people, they'll double stuff up. They say, well, if one is good, I'll have two, I'll try to protect stuff. But the point is, you put that stuff in, you will get pretty darn good protection. But like I said, there's nothing, as far as I know, that can protect you 100%. But 90-some percent, yeah, you can get there. And there's different styles. The one that I showed you is just but one style, and that's just what Gallagher recommended 30 years ago. And I think they still recommend that particular lightning arrestor.
Okay.
No, was there another part of the question there?
There is actually a question from Rachel. The spots that she was referencing without energy or surface water, one of them has a existing well.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, if you're thinking, I bet you she's wondering, okay, how do we pump water? What type of solar panels, etc.
Sure.
would be used for that?
Right. If you have an existing well, part of it depends on, how deep it is. Part of it depends on what style of pump that's in there. So for instance, one of the easiest things, and I did this in a bunch of different places, many existing wells were the old style, so they were just basically windmills, so they would use a windmill, and so that the pump would be down in the ground, and it basically, there was just a shaft that went down there, and it would just physically move up and down, and that would pump your water. And you can use a solar thing on that, but a simpler thing to do is just get yourself a small gasoline engine out there, and then run that thing, put up a 1,500 gallon tank, and that becomes your reservoir, and away you go. And if I know where Rachel's at, there are a few hills, so you might be lucky enough to be on a hill, you might not, but I think you could pump some water there. If you don't have one of those style pumps, or there are many submersible pumps that you can basically shoot down the pipe, and you can electrify those with batteries and solar power if you wish. The thing that I have seen that works generally from an economic point of view is then you generally get yourself a very relatively small pump, so that it doesn't pump a lot of gallons, but you run it for a long time, and then you have a tank above ground, 1,500 gallon tank, 2,000 gallon, whatever you got. Generally one of the big plastic ones is what we generally run, and so then you can keep the costs down for bringing your water up. But then you might have to run your pump 7, 8, 9 hours a day to get enough water for your livestock, or you might have to run it for a couple of days, and then bring the cattle in for maybe they're only going to be in for a 12-hour period. So though it depends on what you've got, but man, if you got one of those old windmill units, they are the easiest thing, just to put a little Briggs and Stratton on there. You pump up all your water in the tank. You just run a wire from your spark plug up to the tank. Then when the tank gets full, it shorts out your spark plug, engine stops. All you got to do. No, had a car hooked up to a pump. Well, that makes sense too.
Well, and I will share, there's a farmer up in Polk County who put like a 50-gallon barrel into a wetland and put a gas-powered pump. And he pumped water quite far up a hill into a 1,000-gallon tank, then would gravity flow that out to his paddocks. And it got to where he would fill the gas can only 3/4 the way full.
Right. That's another good way to do it.
Because then he knew at 3/4 of a gas can, the pump, the engine was going to shut off and the tank would be full at the same time. Took him a couple of weeks to figure it out. And he had a number of children that thought it was great fun to go down in by the wetland to fill it up, to start it up, to get it to pump. And so he wasn't the one making the trip up and down the hill to the wetland to get the pump going. So
sure. And those are, like I say, if you can use it, the gasoline engines are really, they're rock solid, they're relatively cheap. The solar ones are great. I mean, the technology is really great and really robust, but it's generally more expensive. The only other thing, I'll just make a real quick aside, is just for your reference. So if you've got a pressurized water system, just a real quick rule of thumb is about 2.3. You can pound water up 2.3 feet for every 1 psi. So if you're running 40 psi, which is a pretty standard system for a household system or a barn system, basically you're looking at about 80 feet. So if you got a hill that's 80 feet, you can pump that water up and over the hill very easily with 40 psi.
are there any further questions, comments, points of discussion?
I have just one more question on pump and well systems. Has anyone or anybody seen any type of system utilizing a old hand dug well system and incorporating that into use for pumping water out to a spigot line for a frost-free spigot without utilizing a outbuilding or anything to keep the system from freezing up above ground?
Yeah, I'm kind of drawing a blank on that. I mean, I know a lot of the in my area, I'm surrounded by old order ultra orthodox Amish, and they choose not to use pressurized systems, and most of those will have tanks either up on stilts, so they'll basically pump the water from a cistern or from a hand dug well up to basically it's a small water tower. I mean, 8-10 feet, and then those tanks are insulated. I mean, it basically looks like a big outhouse on stilts, and then they run the water underground, or they'll put on the pipes underground, and then they will have frost-free hydrants in their barns and in other areas. So I mean, that's a possibility if you can get the gravity, because remember, it works the other way too. So if you get the water up in the air, for every 2.3 feet, you gain a psi, so a pound per square inch. So you could do it that way. That'd be a possibility. The only thing, a thing that comes to mind, and others might have other ideas. I know that there's been some change in the codes in Wisconsin as far as the admissibility of using a bottom drain, the old style, the Iowa style frost-free hydrants. So basically what they would do is they had a shaft that ran down the pipe, and then the valve The shutoff valve was at the base or at the bottom of the pipe. And so when you pulled the handle, it would open up the valve, 6 feet below, fill the tube, fill the pipe, you get the water. And then when you shut it off, it would shut the water from coming in, but then that pipe then would drain down, making it so that it wouldn't freeze your frost-free hydrant. But as I understand, the code has changed in Wisconsin, and that's no longer, those style are not allowed. I think they've come up with a different style. I believe it's a little more convoluted. Maybe somebody can help me out on that. I haven't.
Yeah, I just had a meeting the other day with the NRCS here in Clark County, and they had told me that I couldn't use the old style, but I've got an existing hand dug well that I would like to utilize for just watering my livestock instead of using the well that's set up for the house. And
Sure.
I was just wondering if anybody had a system to utilize that old hand dug well that doesn't have any water lines in it or anything. It's just an old hand dug well. Back when I was a kid, we used just a sub pump out of it to water our garden and whatnot. And us kids played in the water using that, and it always had more than enough water. So I wanted to try figuring out a system to utilize that.
Yeah, well, the only thing that comes to my mind is just as you were saying is, if you just had a foot valve and a one-way valve on a piece of pipe or hose, dropped it in there, and then you could have your gasoline engine up above for moving stuff. That'd be something, because basically what you're saying is that the hand dug well just becomes like a pond. Or a cistern. It's just a water source. But where it gets a little dicey is when you're trying to say, well, can we make this work in the wintertime? And that would be a little more challenging.
Okay. All right. That's what I was thinking. And I just wanted to know if anybody else had any ideas on that. So
sure.
Thank you.
I almost think that would be an excellent question to throw out on Ask a Grazer. It's a Facebook chat room that was sponsored by Grassworks. And then you get a really, really broad brush stroke of professional farmers like Vance and everybody on this call that'll help provide you some more information.
So that was Ask a Grazer?
Ask a Grazer. Rachel, do you want to put that address in the chat? We can get that to you as well, because I have your email address.
Okay, thank you. That would be great.
Okay, we are at the top of the hour on the button. Hopefully this was a good educational experience for everyone on the call. I've been grazing for a long, long time, and every time I listen to Vance, I learn something new. It's good to have a refresher once in a while for us folks who've been grazing a little bit longer than some others, and it's great to share the knowledge and the guidance. And hopefully we will get to speak with everyone. Vance will be doing part 2 on Saturday from 10 until noon. And Rachel did add that Facebook information into the chat. Kevin?
No, just say thank you, Vance. Really good summary of a lot of things that need to be considered when getting established, and even 25 years into it. So
well, it's one of those things, Kevin, and I really appreciate being asked to chat, and I appreciate that. but it was like I started out with that analogy about playing the guitar. I mean, you know, you can do some pretty decent things, but you can spend the rest of your life becoming a virtuoso on it. And it's the same thing with grazing. And again, I don't want to diss anybody, but you know, I remember myself, you know, the first 3-4 years, man, I thought I had it all figured out for grazing. I knew it all, or you know, but every year throws you a new curve, and I learn every time I go to pasture walks. Every time I do one of these sessions, I learn something, and or I'm reminded of something, and it's important. But it's like anything else. If you're passionate about something and you talk with folks, a lot of good education gets done.
Yeah, it's just the excitement of the year. We have, you know, the snow is gone now and things are actually greening up, and you know, you
Yep.
can see a lot of clover out there is actually doing something already.
It's exciting. It's exciting. So I'm looking forward to the grazing myself. And we had just a little gentle rain here today, and we were a little dry. So it's knock on wood. It's looking like a possibly good start. We'll see. Sure hope so.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Vance. And we
Yes.
will see everyone again on Saturday.
Okay, we'll
Yeah,
see you then.
We hope to see everybody. And if you have any friends that you know could be a good addition to the crew here, just bring them on for Saturday.
That's right. The cost is the same.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Kevin, are you already on? Or did you-
I'm still here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna send out another notice, you know, for Saturday.
Okay.
Maybe repost it on Facebook and then possibly on email too.
Okay, I'll touch base with Linda to see if she can reopen it up.
All the registration.
Yeah. Did you by chance send like the link out directly?
I sent it on Facebook and then targeted to some people I knew, but not the whole. I would like the email list.
Okay. Did you send the link or just the announcement?
I sent both the announcement card and then the link, registration link.
Oh, the registration link. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because there's a couple of names that popped up that I didn't have on the list
Right.
from Linda, which is fine.
Yeah, we put it on. Well, I sent it out also to Organic Valley to a couple field people, and then Rachel posted it like twice on Ask a Grazer.
Okay.
And just whatever, ask people to share it on Facebook.
Okay. Okay. Well, good. Good. I think Saturday is gonna go well. So yeah, this is exciting.
Yep, Vance did very well.
He always does a really good job. Okay, so let's plan on talking closer towards the weekend. All right.
All right, sounds good.
Okay. Have a great evening and thank you.
All right, you too. Thanks, Mary.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.